From HanselMinutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman, hosted by Carl Franklin. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 111, recorded live Tuesday, April 22nd, 2008. Support for Hansel Minutes is provided by Telerik RAD Controls, the most comprehensive suite of components for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.telerik.com. Support is also provided by .NET Developers Journal, the world's leading .NET developer magazine. Online at www.sys-con.com. In this episode, Scott sits down with Phil Haack, Dru Sellers, and Jeffrey Palermo and talks about the ASP.NET MVC Project and Microsoft's changing attitudes towards open source.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and I'm sitting down here at the Alt.NET conference, and I've got Phil Haack, the feature PM for ASP.NET MVC. I've got Jeffrey Palermo, the co-creator of MVCContrib, an open source project that he co-founded with Eric Hexter. And I've got Dru Sellers, a committer on the Castle project. And one component of the Castle project is MonoRail, which is arguably the first MVC project that gained widespread adoption. So I think we've got a really good cross-section of the model view controller kind of .NET ecosystem. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the ASP.NET MVC project, some of the things that the open source community is doing to make it better, and then what the previous MVC project thinks about that. Because a lot of people felt that when ASP.NET MVC began to be announced that the MonoRail project, the first widely adopted model view controller framework, would feel like Microsoft was kind of squashing you. So, Dru, what do you think about that?
Well, being, I guess, a capitalist at heart, I think that competition is a really positive thing. I've already seen features coming out of the Microsoft MVC framework being ported into MonoRail. And some of the features that are coming over are ones that I've been wanting for a long time, but haven't personally figured out how to implement. But I've seen them being ported back over. So, I mean, at first I was skeptical, but I've really enjoyed the extra share of knowledge.
So MonoRail's not going away. You guys didn't just say, "Oh, we'll shut it down now."
No, it's still a bit of a different mindset, I think. I mean, I think they're very close. They're both espousing separation of concerns, which I think is just a really important concept. Mm-hmm. But the way the workflow is still a little bit different. There are still.
Can you give some explicit examples?
Well, my use of it, I would say, is probably different. I have it embedded with Castle's microkernel Windsor, and so I use that quite a bit. And I'm very happy to see that MVC framework has a nice plugin for that. But I mean, and a lot of this comes from my naivete with the Microsoft's version of the MVC framework itself. But when I was playing with it, there were, and I apologize because I believe this is old now, but the attributes on the controllers.
Right. So originally with the Microsoft ASP.NET MVC framework, if you wanted to expose a public controller action, you had to explicitly decorate that with an attribute that said, "This is an action." And we had a lot of pushback from that, from the community. And that was eventually removed.
Yes. And I've heard that. And it's been very enlightening at the same time to see Microsoft taking that feedback and moving forward at what I consider to be a fairly rapid pace.
So what were some examples of things that you said that were being moved over, and maybe an example of the different mindset that the MonoRail project has? And just to be clear, you had mentioned the Windsor microkernel. That's one of the dependency injection containers that comes with the Castle project. It's bundled with Castle. So Castle is the overarching name.
Correct.
And underneath that are Active Record, your database, your view on how databases should be accessed, MonoRail, your view on how a web application should be created, and then the Windsor microkernel, your view on how dependency injection should be done.
Correct. And I'm sorry, now I've lost the question.
The question is, what are some explicit examples of things that have been brought over from Microsoft's project that are keeping MonoRail different and innovative?
Well, the big thing that came over, right, so this made them closer together, was the concept of iController.
Okay.
That was something that I had talked about for a while as wanting in the MonoRail framework from a testability perspective, but we had never gotten to.
You have controllers, as you're a model view controller framework. How do you implement controllers?
No, we have controllers. So iController, as in the interface concept, as being the only thing that you really needed to have. With controller, it was a fairly heavy abstract class that you inherited from.
So the view of a controller in the MonoRail world was a big abstract base class with a lot of functionality that you you inherit from.
Yes. And so I had been pushing for a lighter weight version of that. Mm-hmm. And when that came in, there was a lot of discussion around how that was really nice. There was a lot of positive feedback on that. And then some of the committers to the Castle project went through and did an implementation of that. And
very cool.
That's made my life a lot easier on my apps where I use Castle.
Mm-hmm. And Phil, do you feel like you guys are kind of going out there to crush an open source project?
Absolutely. No, of course not. Yeah. Being from the open source community myself, I mean, I run an open source blog engine. I don't think that's our intention in any of these things.
Presumably, you wouldn't have taken the job if you thought you were.
If I thought our only goal was to crush open source projects, yeah, I wouldn't have taken the job. I think in general, there's sort of this tension between Microsoft and the open source community about what people will call the duplication of efforts, right? Mm-hmm. And I sort of originally kind of like rebelled against that, but I've come around to a more what I would like to consider a more nuanced viewpoint on that, which is that, like most projects are sort of duplication of ideas of other projects, right? Copy, but try to make better. And that's the hope, that we're actually trying to do something new and not just rehash what's already been done. But also that, in many ways, Microsoft, for better or for worse, right or wrong, this is the situation they're in, which is that they do have a market that can't necessarily run open source, software or a market that won't try these things. So, in many times, Microsoft still wants to, serve that market, right? Rather than leave them completely out,
Right. I worked in financial services for 7 years, and it was really difficult for us to get the okay from legal to bring in any kind of an open source framework, and it's certainly not one that we could lean on, and build something fundamental on. Now, Jeffrey, you guys co-founded the MVCContrib project, which is saying that there are things perhaps that the MVC project doesn't necessarily provide out of the box, and you wanted to add that value right off the bat. You felt that you founded this project as soon as it was announced.
Right. And Eric Hexter and I were at the SDR last October.
The software design review for MVC, when a number of insiders are brought up to Microsoft to get a preview of this software and provide feedback on it.
Right. And we found out that the first publicly available preview was going to be released in December. So the day after that was released, we made that project public. We'd been planning it for a little while. And Eric does a lot of work on the configuration management, the automatic publishing of releases and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But essentially, we know that Microsoft's not going to take a dependency on Castle or Hibernate or Structure Map or Spring or all these other third-party libraries. They're not going to take a dependency on that, but the MVCContrib can easily provide the integration points so that these other libraries and these other tools can be easily leveraged for users of the ASP.NET MVC framework and provide extensions on what Microsoft's provided.
Right. It's a convention I've seen in open source to create a contrib or contributions project that runs parallel to that project. I remember first time I came upon it was when NANT came out. NANT, the open source build server, build structure for .NET, and then NANT contrib had all of these other things that really didn't belong in the core.
So onto that point about open source and this particular project, I've had conversations with various members of the open source community. For instance, such as Hamilton.
Who's Hamilton?
Hamilton is the founder of the Castle project, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
And just to get a lot of feedback from the community, and you'll notice that the MVC framework has a lot of extensibility points in order to make it easy and possible to integrate other open source projects. One point that I'm particularly happy about is we have a flavor of the web application project, so that when you start the project, it opens up a test wizard dialog, and it allows you to integrate your own third-party unit test framework. So whether it's NUnit, MBUnit, or XUnit.net, and to have that thing showing up in a Visual Studio dialog, I think that's new for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. To see that, this project is really embracing, integrating with open source projects.
Well, and you're explicitly enabling Jeffrey and his guys to go and say, oh, I can see where we could breathe new life into this or that IOC container. I know that there's been some recent uptick in the interest in a dependency injection container called Ninject. now has a Contrib project, does it not? So I could use that with MVCContrib.
Right. There's actually 6 IOC containers that have integration to the MVC framework in MVCContrib. There's Ninject, Spring.net, Castle Windsor, Structure Map, Unity, and Object Builder.
So you've got a lot of choices.
Right. So the philosophy is that choice is good. So whether it be the MVC framework or MonoRail, whether it be in-unit or MS test, choice is good, and there's never going to be one thing that's going to serve and satisfy the entire world. So just like here at this conference, the one law, the law of 2 feet, that applies, in
right. So the
open
law
space
of
software too.
We're at an open spaces conference, and the law of 2 feet means that if you don't like something, you can walk away. If you're in a conference session that you're not appreciating, then you can just stand up and walk away. And I've been in a number of spaces just now where people have left. So you can really vote by using the tool that makes you the happiest.
Oh, sure. Right. And there's lots of options in MVCContrib. It's just a smorgasbord of extra features that you can use in conjunction with the MVC framework. It doesn't take away anything that Microsoft provides. It only adds on top of.
Are there any places in MVCContrib where there's a statement being made like, we think Microsoft did this wrong, so we're providing an alternative, like a different imagining of how a controller should work, or I don't think views should have been done this way, therefore we'll wrap it and do it in a different way?
Yes, there's a couple of those. One is the convention controller, and it has a concept of rescues where if a exception happens in an action, you can have it rerouted to a different action that knows how to handle errors for a particular controller. And there's other conventions that are supported in that controller base class if you choose to use it. Also, view data extensions, previously called SmartBag for a little bit, but view data extensions takes the stance that strongly typed views aren't really applicable when you have a application of any complexity, and allows extension methods to strongly type access to view data while enabling you to have views without a code behind file.
Interesting. So I'm going to take just 1 second and thank our sponsors, and then I want to ask Dru about rescues. Hi, it's Scott Hanselman here. Hope you're enjoying the show so far. I'm coming at you from another place and time. Sorry to interrupt the show, but I want to let you know that putting together a podcast like this every week isn't free. The folks that pay the bandwidth bill is Telerik. They make the show possible, and they also make some pretty cool products like Telerik Sitefinity. It's a development platform for constructing websites, community portals, and intranets, built all on ASP.NET 2.0, so you're using the various well-known goodies like master pages and membership services, data model provider, things that you already know. It's pretty flexible. You've got a very robust core that you can customize. You can plug in anything that you want, from complex applications for a CRM or just a little widget that displays the weather. If you're not big into the code thing, that's cool too. You get a full set of features out of the box like workflow, multilingual sites, content versioning that can all be added without code. There's also a whole bunch of pluggable modules and components for news, blogs, forums, polls, lists. This is all stuff that you can do without code. And it's a pretty good looking product as well. You've got a nice Web 2.0 administrative interface that lets you, as well as your boss who's not technical, be really productive. So check out sitefinity.com, and we'll get you right back to the show. Thanks a lot. So rescues that Jeffrey mentioned a moment ago was this a way to say that if something goes wrong within a controller action, I'm going to go ahead and redirect to another one. That was borrowed from MonoRail, was it not?
Well, MonoRail certainly had it.
Where did that originally come from?
Well, I don't know I can't speak to where it originally came from, because when I got there, it was already there.
Uh-huh.
It's definitely very nice to have a central spot to have your exception handling for website.
Mm-hmm.
It's also nice to be able to do that by type. And I'm not sure if the MVC framework does that by type.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So if you want a database exception screen, if you want a screen for authentication access, if your code is throwing an exception, you do not have access to do this method, you can show a screen that says just that.
Oh, so type specific views when an exception goes wrong. So you're typing it based on that exception type.
Correct.
So if I throw new, I'm trying to think, database exception, or like you said, authentication, authorization. You could have separate views for each of those.
Yeah. If you had a framework exception, you could just show a generic, hey, there was a problem. Please retry. If not, contact somebody. If you caught an application exception, so one that you've made that you've thrown, such as a security exception, you can say, hey, you're not authorized to do this. Please follow these steps and get permission.
Interesting. I can see where if someone could argue both that that's a really good idea, but at the same time you're using an exception and then indirectly causing a navigation. I could see where someone could argue that you should catch that and do the redirect yourself.
You certainly could.
Interesting. What do you think about that, Phil? Is that something you're going to put in the MVC?
Yeah. So I judging by the name, I'm guessing rescues came from Rails, which has the rescue concept. And so that's definitely something we've seen a lot of people ask us about. So we'll probably have something like that at some point. I mean, right now we have the concept of action filters, so it's pretty easy to write one that does that. But that's something that we're looking at to have in the product. And I was thinking about the convention controller Jeffrey mentioned, and the irony there being, and correct me if I'm wrong, that I wrote the first version of that one, right? Yeah.
The convention controller?
The convention controller.
So let's talk a little bit about this convention controller. Now, certainly if you've made it this far into this podcast and you're not familiar with MVC, you might want to back up or pause and take a moment to listen to some of the screencasts or go up to www.asp.net/MVC. There's a lot of content that will get you up to speed on MVC. So if we're using terms like action filter, controller, that you're not familiar with, you might want to take a moment to catch up on that. Now, action filters are a particularly powerful aspect of MVC, and I want to come back to that. But the notion of a convention controller is important because a fundamental change to controller has just recently happened with this latest release. And what is that? And why would someone dislike it so much that they would try to recreate the old style of doing things?
So I'm assuming you're talking about we made a refactoring where controller actions are now called by another class that we call the action invoker, and the controller actions return a value to them in the form of a type that derives from action result.
So previously, you would say public void foo, and then that would be available to the net just by virtue of the fact that it's public. Now, previously, as we mentioned before, you used to have to put an attribute on it and say controller action. Then we just said if it's public, it's part of a controller, it's available. But it always had a void return value. Mm-hmm. And that made things inconvenient.
What made things inconvenient was that within your action method, you had to call render view. And what render view would do was actually try to use the HTTP pipeline and spit out the final view and use all of that. And the problem there that lied in that is when you were writing a unit test, you're not running in the context of a full request with the whole ASP.NET pipeline. And so it became a big hassle to test even simple action methods because you had to mock out using fake test doubles or a mock framework. You had to basically fake out the whole pipeline just to test your simple action method.
So if I understand what you're saying, this notion of separation of concerns is fundamental in that it's not really the controller's responsibility to go futzing around inside of HTTP context or doing things with the response object or the request object. Certainly they can do that, but if you really want to separate your concerns such that things are very testable, you don't want to do that. If someone calls render view, that means that now we're running around inside of HTTP context in our stack frame. We're literally waiting around. So you've changed it. So rather than having a void return value, you return an action result. And then the work of calling render view happens elsewhere?
That's correct. So the actual work of calling render view happens after your action method has been invoked. The key point there is that as much as possible, we want you to focus on your business logic and less on framework, writing code for the framework. Mm-hmm. The more you're thinking about the framework and what you need, how to manipulate our framework, the less you're focused on what you really need to get done. And we just want to minimize that. If we've minimized that to a degree where you're almost never really thinking about the framework, then we're doing our job well.
Okay. So now Jeffrey's project added a convention controller that I think you had originally written. And what does convention controller do?
It adds some extra functionality so that you don't have to have as many lines of code do the same thing. For instance, if you don't want to declare the name of the view, then you don't have to. It'll just pick the view that is the same name as the action name. And the returning the action result, actually just this past week with the new code drop of the MVC framework, we've refactored a bit to keep in line with the new code for the MVC framework. So we're kind of following along. Right. And there's not a whole lot of disagreement as far as the philosophy from what Microsoft is coming out with and with MVCContrib. There's only a few points, but for the most part, the MVCContrib is adding on as opposed to taking the stance that we think is being done wrong. So let's provide something different.
Okay, so less of the functionality that's provided in MVCcontrib is focused on disagreement or some kind of political statement within code, and more about, we just want to add this. We want to make this available. We want to make this one more choice.
Right. And as there's going to be many, many more changes. And as the MVC framework changes, the MVCcontrib project is going to be refactored along with that. And so, we think Microsoft's doing a pretty good job, and we're providing more choices. And so, there's a few points where we provide alternatives, but we don't try to take anything away.
Do you think that this has something to do with the fact that Phil and the MVC team have tried to really engage with the community and not do this in a vacuum? I would think that in the past, if this were done in an ivory tower somewhere, MVCcontrib might be more of a statement that your guys aren't listening. You're not doing this right. We're going to do this differently.
Well, that's exactly why. I mean,
because this seems very genial. I mean, you guys are all very friendly and stuff. Now we know Phil's a nice guy, but
yeah, you can't see us right now. We're hugging.
Oh yeah.
But
I'm just saying that you guys are saying that they're making changes that are substantive from release to release, such that there's less and less to disagree on, because it's more of a community design decision.
Right. And there's some ideas that popped into MVCcontrib early that they took and put into the framework directly. So they've been super transparent. I think.
Did you just say super transparent?
Super transparent.
Fantastic.
I think all the different teams at Microsoft could take a lesson from the MVC framework team about how to involve community input. Code drops every 6 weeks. Has that ever happened?
I don't know. Not in my lifetime.
So I think they're doing a tremendous job, taking input and providing insight into what they're doing. And yeah, MVCcontrib is just to provide extra options. And as the MVC framework changes, MVCcontrib will be refactored right along with it.
Now, Dru, do you think that there's anything that is going on in MVCcontrib that can be pulled into MonoRail, or what aspects of MonoRail and the Castle project have come over to MVCcontrib?
One of the first things that I saw come over to the MVCcontrib was the discussion of the container aspect, was the alternate view choices. So if you don't like the way the syntax of the ASP.NET view engine works, you can go and you can use InVelocity, which is an alternate templating system.
Because by default, we have a thing called the WebForms view engine that uses the very familiar ASPX syntax of doing things. But in MonoRail, you have a number of view engines, both Braille and NVelocity. So
correct.
How is NVelocity different than using the ASPX pages that we're familiar with?
Well, the key difference for me is the level of control that you have over the HTML generated. I think you can still do a lot of this with the the WebForms engine, but for me, it was conceptually simpler to control. It was a lighter weight concept. You had to know the HTML, but if you did and you wanted that level of power, it gave it to you.
Hi, this is Scott, and I want to let you know that this week's Hansel Minutes is brought to you by CodeBetter.com. The CodeBetter.com blog network. It's made up of over 20 industry leaders and speakers who are passionate about delivering tried-and-true solutions to real-world problems for building better software. These guys are not only our sponsor this week, but they're also my friends. The CodeBetter blog network, it's where industry leaders blog. You can find them at CodeBetter.com, as well as Devlicious, DEVLICIO.us. So in WebForms, we have some limited control with controls, but we have master pages, we have theming, we have skinning, we have a lot of CSS stuff that is built into Visual Studio with the WebForms view engine. With NVelocity, what does it look like? Does it look like classic ASP?
InVelocity looks much closer to classic ASP in that it's a single pass. I think both frameworks have, master pages. We don't have a really killer IDE experience. It's just much simpler.
Kind of more raw, just right there at the end. You get complete control of your anchor brackets at a very basic level.
Exactly. It's more raw. There are some interesting extension points as far as if you use some syntax options, then you can get more interesting control. So safer output, default auto HTML encode.
Oh, really?
That I really
default
enjoyed.
auto HTML encode. Okay. So there's a number of options when someone want to go and decide whether they're going to use a different controller. There's certainly a million options on the model side and 3-4 different options on the view side. I've spoken about Enamel in the past, that Velocity, the WebForms view engine, and then also one called Braille.
Yeah, and Braille would be the Boo-based, an alternate .NET language that has some very interesting type declarations.
It's very Python-like in its syntax.
It's got a very strong Python sense to it.
Now, kind of in conclusion, I wanted to ask you, Phil, there's been a lot of talk here at Alt.NET Conference about the DLR and dynamic languages. How long till we get Ruby or Python views or controllers? That sounds like a pretty exciting thing, and I've been seeing some stuff on your blog that you've been messing around with Ruby and MVC.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the dynamic languages. I sort of wrote on my post on my blog that I'm not quite ready to get all meta programming, hours at a time, but I do see a huge value even now in using dynamic languages for configuration type stuff, like using DSLs. So I've written, I'll be posting to my blog pretty soon, the ability to define routes in Ruby, for an MVC project, as well as an update to my Ruby view engine, where it's similar to RHTML, and you can use Ruby in the view. So
RHTML being the default Ruby view that Rails uses.
Yeah. It's similar in spirit. I just called it that because it was very similar to that, but I don't yet support layouts, which is like the master page equivalent. But I think we'll see a lot more integration and hybrid approaches where people are mixing static languages with dynamic languages, and I'm hoping that MVC is also one of the first projects that sort of demonstrates how to do that. I mean, all of this DLR work I'm doing on my own time is just kind of playing around right now.
But as a feature PM, this is the kind of thing that you do at Microsoft to figure out if it's going to be possible and if people want it.
Exactly.
So it wouldn't be unfair to say that we could envision a future where I might have an NHibernate model, I might have a velocity view with a convention controller, or maybe I might swap out a couple of Iron Ruby views. All working together in happiness and joy.
Have fun.
Very cool. Well, thank you very much, Phil Haack, Jeffrey Palermo, and Dru Sellers for sitting down and talking to me today. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll talk to you again next week.